I am 77 years old, and I have been carrying a sentence inside me for longer than I can rightly remember. It sits behind my ribs like a small stone, and some days it is heavy enough that it slows my breath. I am saying this now because the shape of the days has changed. There are more afternoons than mornings, and the afternoons are long enough to turn small things into questions. When I met Margaret, I was 26, freshly married in the late spring, hair still a stubborn dark, hands that a foreman trusted with a new set of blueprints. She was 24, laughed with her whole face, worked part-time at the library, and took care of dinners like it was the most ordinary, sacred thing. We rented a tiny place above a bakery, and the smell of yeast and coffee seeped into the curtains. I remember how she would roll the hems of her dresses when she was bent over a sewing machine, how she kept a little radio by the sink. We were poor, but not frightened. We had plans, and the plans were enough to make us keep going. I was practical in those years. Practical meant saying yes to the promotion that required more hours in a different city. Practical meant doing what men did in my father's family, steady work, saving, thinking that stability was a kind of love. When the offer came, I spoke to Margaret, and she nodded. She said, "If that's what you want, we'll manage." There was a tiny lift in her voice that I mistook for relief. I took it as permission. We had 2 children in quick succession, Tom and Julie, and they grew up with the sound of my briefcase at the door, and the radio jarred at night while I read documents by a small lamp. I went to the office early, came home late. There were meetings that lasted into the evening and trips on Wednesdays. There were yearly targets and new supervisors who wanted drive. I learned how to be indispensable and how to speak in a language of margins and projections. It suited me. It made me feel useful. It gave me a certain pride. Margaret's life adjusted around mine in ways I did not notice until later. She took on the PTA, her voice softening at the edges of her sentences when she explained a bake sale. She painted dishes on the kitchen shelves and labeled jars of preserves in her careful script. She volunteered at the library's after-school program and taught an elderly neighbor how to read cursive again. She kept our calendars and remembered the birthdays we almost missed. She held the house steady in ways that did not register as work to me. She kept continuity, which I equated with love. There were small moments that, in the telling, looked like nothing. The night of our first big raise, I came home and she had made a pie. We ate it in silence while I talked about how the raise would mean better schooling for the kids. She smiled and said, "That's good." A week later, she asked if I could come to Julie's recital. It was a Friday. I had a presentation Monday. I said no. She folded her hands and said, "I understand." The recital was a modest thing. A dozen parents, a trembling piano, my daughter's 4th grade bow. I caught myself thinking about the presentation in the dark car ride home, and when Julie came to drop her coat on the back of my chair, I praised her for being brave. She said, "Dad, you weren't there." I told her I was sorry and then explained why I had to be gone. She nodded slowly, like someone trying to accept a reason she could not feel. The pattern fixed itself. Birthdays moved to weekends I could spare. Holidays were framed around my work schedule. I learned to apologize and then continue. Margaret stopped asking me to rearrange. She began to say, "We'll do it another time," and she would set the table for 2 when I came home unexpectedly late. When Tom graduated high school and asked me to make the toast, I wrote it on the plane to a conference. I delivered words I had rehearsed, and afterward, Tom clapped politely. He did not seek me out that night. Later, after a few beers, he told me I missed the walk across the stage. I had been sleeping on the hotel bed, exhausted. I remember the way his voice narrowed, not so much angry as disappointed, which cut deeper. Time, in the way it does, blurred months into years without fanfare. There were promotions, a house with a better kitchen, a lawn I mowed early every Sunday before the meetings began. I bought a small car we could afford, and then a slightly better one. We took a week's vacation when the bank agreed on a mortgage. These were sensible things. They were the very fabric of a life I thought I was building for everyone. Straightforward decisions. I told myself we were securing the future. Margaret began to cough in her quiet way. At first, it was a season, hay fever, we thought. The doctor said it might be allergies. She dismissed it with tea and a handkerchief. When the cough lingered, I suggested she see a specialist. She refused. It was easier to go on as if we were ordinary folks with ordinary inconveniences. We were tired from work, from raising children, from the small deaths the years bring. There were tests and there were reassurances. She joked about hypochondria. I believed her jokes. The slow accumulation of small postponements is the thing that ages a marriage more surely than any single blow. There were conversations deferred until tomorrow, and photographs never developed because I kept the camera film under a drawer, promising to take it to the shop. There were apologies that were not accompanied by changed behavior. I'll call. I'll be there. I'll take a day off. They were words that sounded active, but they were easy to say when the doing required rearrangement of plans I had already thought sacred. I did not notice the way her hands seemed to seek things more than before, the seam of a hem, the edge of a napkin, the texture of bread. She would hum half a tune, settle the radio to a station she liked, and then move through the rooms like someone collecting memories to tuck under a pillow. She began to have moments of fatigue I catalogued as stress. She laughed at my jokes even when they were old, the same laugh that used to make me look up from my plate. Those were the nights I told myself we were fine. There is a moment in most stories where clarity arrives and people speak of thunderclaps. My life taught me that clarity often comes as quiet arithmetic, the doctor's list of options, and then the slow diminuendo of hope. 2 years before she died, they found a tumor. It had been there longer than we could imagine. The tests unfolded in their formal, measured way. There were meetings with specialists, grave faces that practiced neutrality, and language that felt like a foreign currency, staging, response rate, palliative. We talked about treatment plans in the doorway of our kitchen, the sunlight making shadows on the countertop. She asked sometimes if I hated her. She asked it like someone checking the weather. I was stunned by the question and said no, as if the word could hold enough weight. We tried treatments. They took the edge off some days, but made other days worse. She lost hair, and with it she lost something else, an ease to being seen. I had to help her into the shower sometimes, and I realized I had never learned the right angle to dry her hair or how to braid it the way she liked. The first time I failed at it, she laughed so soft, I felt as if the laugh was apologizing for asking. People came by for a while. Casseroles were left at the door. It was a short season of attention, neighbors who meant well, colleagues who stood at a respectful distance. Then the visits reduced to numbers on a calendar. There were small mercies and there were terrible omissions. I read to her when the light allowed, and we spoke about the children. I took a day off work for an appointment and felt the cold slip of guilt as I checked my emails in the waiting room. There were Saturdays when I planned to be with her, and the phone would ring with a client needing a quick word. I would tell her I had to step out, and she would say, "Go, it's all right." It is strange how people co-sign their own absence. It is stranger how you accept that co-signing as normal. The day she said the words that have lived inside my chest since was ordinary in every way. It was late summer, the garden had lost that lean spring green to a weightier, hotter hue. We sat at the back stoop with our tea. I had been reading a report, and she had finished a crossword. She set her pen down and looked at me as if for the first time in years. She took my hand, which had not been taken in that deliberate way since our honeymoon, and squeezed like someone testing the material. "You don't have to fix everything," she said. Her voice was small, patient. I remember thinking she meant the house, the bills, the lawn. I smiled like an automatic response. She went on, "You don't have to carry it all alone. You can lay some of it down." It was a simple sentence, and it should have been the start of conversation. I made excuses. I said we had been doing fine. I said I was grateful. I told her I would try. Earlier in the day, I had already promised a week away for a client meeting, a trip I had decided was necessary because it would secure a contract that had been dangling in negotiations.
I remember the pressure at my temples, and I remember thinking that the trip would not be the end of anything. When I told her about the meeting, she nodded. She said, "You should go if you need to. Everything is under control here." 3 weeks later, she was in the hospital. The antibiotics did not take. Something in her body refused to respond. I was on that week's plane, and then on another week the following week, skipping flights, changing schedules, trying to press myself into 2 places at once. I thought being present in 1,000 small ways would make up for the time I had not spent. I was wrong. She called me in the early hours, voice thin as tissue. She said, "I'm cold," and I remember the way the words made me do something clumsy, call a nurse, ask for blankets, ask for a doctor, pacing outside a fluorescent room. The doctor sat me down and explained the end with the practiced patience of